Game of Thrones, starting by hatching a giant dragon. Chapter 11. The dragon beyond the wall. Jon had always thought he was used to the cold. The winters in the north were long enough and the blizzards of Winterfell were biting enough. But when he truly set foot on the lands beyond the wall, he realized he was wrong. The cold here seemed alive. It would burrow into fur, pierce through bone, and finally settle in one's blood. Uncle Benjen Stark led the way, his horse's hooves crunching dully into the knee-deep snow. They had a long way to go. If the dragon was not out hunting, it was at least a week's journey from here to her lair. Even the wildlings skirt around that area. Occasionally someone wanders in by mistake, but very few come out alive. Uncle Benjen Stark's voice was low as he said this. That dragon had never been a gentle creature. Growing up in such a brutal place beyond the wall, how could she be tame? Tell me again, why must you bring this young man to a place like this? Jon frowned and looked at their other companion. Alliser Thorne, the master-at-arms of the Night's Watch, had been sent by Lord Commander Mormont to escort them. Thorne did not know the true purpose of this journey. He had only been told that he must come along and had no other choice. From Jon's observations over the past few days, Thorne was not an easy man to get along with. His face was always tight, his words were harsh, and his eyes were as cold as stone. When Mormont mentioned Thorne, he had said, "He has a bad temper and has caused me no end of trouble over the years, but he has not had an easy life." When the House Targaryen fell, Tywin Lannister gave him a choice: join the Night's Watch or face the executioner's block. If he recognizes your identity and realizes that the Targaryen line has not been completely extinguished, I cannot think of anyone better suited to escort you on this journey. His temper is foul, but when it comes to skill, he is a true master. Jon did not know what Thorne had experienced over the years, but he knew that this man had once been loyal to House Targaryen. After the rebellion ended, he did not die on the executioner's block but instead came to the wall. Benjen Stark glanced at Thorne. "We are taking this boy to see an old friend. That place is far from the wildling lands, it should be safe enough." Thorne scoffed, clearly not believing this explanation, but he dared not defy the Lord Commander's orders and could only follow along with a cold face. "What safety is there to speak of in a place like this, you fool?" Thorne cursed irritably. "If you are going to be this noisy the whole way, I will consider leaving you here," Uncle Benjen Stark warned, frowning. They arrived in front of the cave just as the sky was turning dark. Jon saw the gaping cave entrance from afar, and his heart beat a little faster involuntarily. The cave he had seen countless times in his dreams had finally appeared in reality. The wind howled through the valley, whipping up snow, and the cave entrance was pitch black and deep, like a giant open mouth. He knew that the white dragon, which had accompanied him for 12 years, was inside. Thorne's expression was terrifyingly grim. "Do you intend for us to stay in this cave? Are you waiting for a bear to maul us to death?" Jon dismounted and walked straight toward the cave entrance. Thorne cursed and jumped off his horse, striding after him. "Stop, you fool!" A low roar rolled out from the depths of the cave, making the ground tremble. Thorne froze in place and Uncle Benjen Stark froze too, while the horses snorted nervously, nearly breaking free from their reins. Jon did not stop until he was a few steps from the cave entrance. He stared into the pitch blackness. Thump. "What?" Thorne's voice was very low. "Stark, what kind of place have you brought us to?" Uncle Benjen Stark did not answer. Thump. The sound was very close now. Jon could feel the slight vibration from the ground, crawling from the soles of his feet all the way up his spine. Amethyst-like specks of light flickered in the depths of the darkness like some kind of living stars. Benjen Stark's knuckles, gripping the reins tightly, had turned white, and Thorne's breathing behind him became rapid. She finally walked completely out of the cave entrance. Her massive body nearly filled the entire height of the cave, and her snow-white scales shimmered with a cold light under the pale daylight. Every breath she exhaled condensed into large clouds of white mist that lingered before her face for a long time. Ignoring the other two, she stopped a few steps away from Jon, looking down at the small, thin figure from above and studied him silently for a long time. Then she suddenly reared up, landed heavily, and let out a deafening roar in his direction. The roar nearly shattered Jon's eardrums. The dragon's teeth gleamed with a cold, sword-like light in the night, and the forest for miles around fell silent, suppressed by the roar. The horses let out shrill whinnies, nearly breaking free from their reins. Thorne cursed and instinctively took a step back, his hand trembling so hard he could barely grip his sword. The great dragon did not continue to advance. She simply stood there, lowering her head to inspect him inch by inch with those vertical pupils from head to toe, and then from toe to head as if sensing something. She slowly lowered her neck, her nostrils flaring as she leaned closer as if to sniff the scent on him. Jon could feel that scorching breath hitting his face, carrying a warmth that was almost burning. He stood his ground without retreating, though his whole body was trembling. Finally, she pulled her head back, and the sharp wariness in those purple eyes faded away bit by bit. Jon tremblingly took off one glove and reached out his hand toward her. The great dragon lowered her head, and her warm breath fell upon his palm. In that instant, Jon's whole body shuddered violently. Something unexplainable suddenly welled up in his heart, snow filling the sky, purple eyes, the low breathing coming from the depths of the cave. Countless nights waking up from dreams, things he had once thought were just hallucinations. Now they were all truly standing before him. His chest heaved violently and his throat felt as if it were blocked by something. He could not manage to get a complete sentence out for a long time. You. It really is you. Jon's voice was hoarse. The great dragon blinked. Her warm nose tip was still pressed against his palm. Jon suddenly smiled, but tears flowed down first. Thorne behind him stared fixedly at the white dragon. A dragon, it was actually a dragon, not a legend, not a story made up by bards, but a truly living dragon. His breathing became heavy. The Red Keep 20 years ago, the Mad King, Dragonstone, Prince Rhaegar, those names he thought had long been buried in the grave suddenly all came alive, surging into his throat one after another. He looked at the black-haired boy and then at the great dragon with her nose tip pressed against the boy's palm, purple dragon eyes exactly the same as the eyes of the Targaryen royal family. His knees suddenly lost their strength. Thump. He fell heavily to his knees in the snow. The wind and snow swept across the wasteland. Thorne kept his head lowered, his shoulders trembling slightly for a long time. Only then did he speak in a voice that sounded almost dazed. Seven hells. The dragon is actually still alive. Chapter 12. Dragon named Coldfire. The night had completely darkened and the snowstorm had gradually weakened. Jon Stark was the first to snap out of it. He dismounted and tied the reins to two crooked, withered trees. "We will camp near here tonight." His voice was still a bit tight, "closer to the cave entrance so we can keep an eye on any movement." Alliser did not get up. He remained kneeling in the snow, his gaze locked firmly on the white dragon, unable to look away for a long time. Jon withdrew his hand, a lingering warmth remaining on his palm. He looked down at the amethyst-like eyes before him and suddenly felt it was absurd. In 12 years of dreams, he had never given her a name. "I should give you a name," he whispered, as if speaking to himself. The dragon did not answer, only let out a low murmur and rubbed its snout against his palm again. The campfire was quickly started by Uncle Jon Stark, and the three of them sat around it, neither speaking first. As the firelight flickered, Jon stared at the orange-red glow reflected on the snow-white scales, suddenly remembering Rhaegar's last words, "Fire will wake her." He looked up at the massive body beside him and the surrounding snow-covered landscape, thinking for a long time until he finally came up with a name. "I will call you Coldfire, okay?" Those amethyst-like eyes suddenly constricted, and something deep within the pupils was instantly ignited. The dragon suddenly raised its neck, a long screech erupting from its throat. Shaking snow down from above the campfire, Alliser pressed his hand to the hilt of his sword, but Jon Stark reached out and held him back. The screech gradually lowered, turning into a series of rapid, low rumbling sounds, as if some long-suppressed response had finally found an outlet. Coldfire lowered her head, her forehead pressing heavily against Jon's shoulder with such force that it almost knocked him over into the snow. Her warm breath puffed onto the back of his neck, carrying a scorching warmth. Jon reached out to hug the rough scales, his throat tightening. Jon Stark and Alliser exchanged a glance, neither speaking. The campfire gradually died down, leaving only a few wisps of smoke that swirled upward, mixing with the chill of the ice plains. Jon leaned against Coldfire's broad neck. Her warm body fluctuated gently with her breathing, even warmer than he had imagined. Coldfire was incredibly affectionate towards him, as if they were old friends reunited after many years. The muscles beneath her scales rose and fell gently with her breathing, and her tail tip occasionally curled around his calf, as if confirming he was still there. When his hand stroked her scales or when he met those eyes, it felt as if they shared a telepathic connection. The feeling was indescribable, like some contract already written in their blood. The dragon slowly blinked, her body shifted slightly behind him, and then her eyes slowly closed. Before closing them, those amethyst-like pupils lingered on Jon Stark and Alliser Thorne for a brief moment each. Sir Alliser's gaze never left Jon. Since learning the truth, even his breathing had become lighter than usual, as if afraid of disturbing something that should not be disturbed. "Sorry I didn't tell you in advance that we were leaving the wall and bringing you here," Jon said softly. "It's fine, Your Highness." Sir Alliser Thorne already knew Jon's Aegon Targaryen's identity. Jon Stark had told him. Jon frowned. "I am not a prince. You are a descendant of Targaryen, you have a dragon, you are the rightful heir to the Iron Throne." Alliser interrupted him, his tone devoid of any joking, instead carrying a nearly solemn earnestness as if stating an irrefutable fact. "I don't even know if I want to be king," Jon confessed. "There are only a few people left in my family now. Aemon is already old and joined the Night's Watch long ago, and I don't know where my other kin are at this moment." Alliser pursed his lips. Jon Stark eyed him warily. "Jon is only 12 years old now. It is too early to discuss these things. He is likely the last sane man of House Targaryen. We have received news that Viserys' mental state is becoming increasingly unstable. He may have inherited his father's madness." Knight frowned upon hearing this. "And what about his sister? Daenerys is doing well." Jon's voice was a few degrees lower than before, as if he did not want to dwell on that subject. "Did you escape?" Jon Stark didn't tell me the details. "Lyanna Martell is not my mother. My father secretly married Lyanna Stark. They named me Aegon, just like my half-brother." Alliser gasped, his gaze sweeping back and forth across that young face as if trying to find some trace unique to House Targaryen. "I finally understand now why Lord Stark was willing to take such a huge risk to protect you." would never stand by and watch an innocent baby die, regardless of whether he was of House Stark or not, Benjen Stark countered. If Robert Baratheon knew he was Rhaegar's child, he would definitely kill him. However, your highness, I think it would be wiser for you to pose as Princess Elia's son, to pose as Elia's Aegon Targaryen. If anyone with ill intent hears you called Jon Snow, they will soon understand your true identity. Wouldn't they know? Benjen Stark asked. House Lannister presented the bodies to Robert in the throne room. A flash of murderous intent crossed Alizer's face, his fingers unconsciously rubbing the hilt of his sword. Mountain smashed Aegon's face until it was unrecognizable. You can say that when House Lannister sacked King's Landing, they swapped that child for another baby, and the dragon will dispel all doubts about this matter. At the mention of his half-brother's tragic fate, Jon shuddered, his fingertips subconsciously gripping the edge of Coldfire's scales. It's worth a try. I don't want House Stark to be implicated because of me. Benjen Stark nodded and reached out to pat his nephew's shoulder. No matter what happens, we will always protect you, Jon. Highness, Alizer corrected. Just call me Jon, Sir Alizer. Jon smiled dryly, also carrying a bit of stubbornness. You can't treat me like a prince at Castle Black, someone will notice, you'd better get used to it. Well, Jon, Alizer bit onto the name and recited it once as if confirming if he could say it smoothly. He looked back at the sleeping Coldfire behind him, her breathing was low and long, each exhalation carrying a faint wisp of white mist. Now that you have found her, what are your plans next? I need to get to know her first, I must learn how to ride her and I must learn how to fight alongside her. That why Lord Stark sent you to Castle Black, to have Aemon teach you about House Targaryen and teach you how to tame dragons. I also came to train with the Night's Watch, Jon said. Father, I'm still used to calling him father, he raised me. He paused and laughed softly, looking down. He's always been teaching Rob Theon and me how to use a sword, but I still need more practice and it is closer to the dragon here. Lord Commander wants you to teach him how to fight, Alizer, Benjen Stark added, his tone carrying a touch of playfulness. A happy smile appeared on Alizer's face. I would be honored to teach you, your highness. Thank you. Jon's gaze fell back onto Coldfire and he reached out to gently cover her scales. But that is something to discuss after we return to Castle Black. I think I need to stay here with her for at least a few days. The night wind swept through the valley, the remaining sparks of the campfire were blown in all directions, and the cries of a few ravens came from the distance. Chapter 13. The first flight morning arrived. Jon took a deep breath, the icy air seeping into his lungs, carrying a hint of the scent of burning pine, instantly dispelling the lingering sleepiness. Coldfire was already awake, lying on the ground dozing while bathed in sunlight. Her scales shimmered with a fine, silvery-white luster in the morning light, as if covered in a layer of frost. She yawned, revealing razor-sharp teeth capable of piercing a bear, and the hot breath exhaled from deep within her throat condensed into a white mist in the cold air. Jon looked up and down at the massive body, his gaze moving inch by inch from her shoulders to her spine, then falling upon that pair of folded wings, pondering how to climb onto the dragon's back. I should have asked Aemon what to do before I left, Jon said, the white breath he exhaled dissipating in front of him. This isn't quite the same as riding a horse, is it? Benjen Stark laughed, his arms folded across his chest. Thorne looked thoughtfully at the behemoth, his fingers unconsciously rubbing his jaw. I think it's best to sit at the base of the neck or a little further back, or you could try climbing up the wings or shoulders. Jon really couldn't think of a better way. He walked up to Coldfire, his boot soles making soft crunching sounds on the snow. Coldfire watched him curiously, her pupils slightly constricting. He placed his hand on her snout and a warmth radiated into his palm. His hand slid across Coldfire's cheek, the texture rough yet strangely delicate, then brushed past her neck, continuing downward toward her massive body. Coldfire turned her head, a low rumble emanating from her throat as she gazed at him. He rested his hand on her broad shoulder, looked at the height he needed to overcome to climb onto her back, and swallowed hard. His small stature was of no help in this situation. Jon turned to the wings. They were close to the ground, the wing membranes revealing a faint, pale blue-white hue in the sunlight, where the dense veins could be clearly seen. Assuming he didn't slip while climbing, this might be the best opportunity. He gripped the thick wing bone with both hands, his palms stinging from the cold scales. He leapt up, steadied himself, and swung one leg over the wing. Coldfire seemed confused by this action. She tilted her neck slightly and cast a sidelong glance at him. Jon slowly climbed up the wing, keeping his center of gravity extremely low with every step. The moment he reached her back, the body beneath him moved violently. Jon gasped, thrown onto the hard scales, his back aching, and he quickly grabbed onto everything he could beneath him. Coldfire was still moving, using her wing claws to prop herself up. And the whole world shook violently. There was a gap at the end of two dark gray folds on the dragon's neck. He shimmied up along her spine, his knuckles turning white from the exertion, and managed to wedge himself right between the two folds. Half his body fit perfectly, as if he were born for it. Coldfire tilted her head to look, then crouched down. Jon's heart skipped a beat. Oh no! Coldfire lunged upward, and the instant her wings beat against the ground to take flight, A massive blast of air rushed toward him, nearly making him unable to breathe. Jon hurriedly reached out to grab two thick spikes on her neck, his nails digging deeply into his palms. He clamped his knees tightly against the dragon's body, prostrating himself along her spine, and could feel every heartbeat from within Coldfire, steady and powerful like a giant drum. With every beat of Coldfire's wings, her body rose and fell accordingly. Before he could even react, the campfire on the ground had already shrunk to an insignificant speck. A dragon's roar made his eardrums ache. The bone-chilling wind hit his face, making it almost impossible for him to open his eyes, and tears streamed from the corners of his eyes only to be quickly dispersed by the cold wind. The next moment, Coldfire banked sharply. Jon felt the whole world tilt, his heart suddenly in his throat, and he gripped the dragon's back with all his might, nearly being thrown from the heights. By the time he steadied himself again, his chest was heaving violently, his breathing as rapid as if he had just finished a long-distance sprint. Coldfire suddenly dove. The sensation of weightlessness seized his entire body, his stomach churning, and the snowfield rushed toward him at an astonishing speed. The woods, hills, and snow-covered rocks rapidly magnified. Just at the moment before she was about to touch the ground, Coldfire spread her wings again. The gale burst forth with a roar, her massive body grazed the treetops, and the snow was swept into the sky by the airflow. Jon instinctively grabbed the spikes behind her neck and gently nudged them to the left. Coldfire actually reacted. The dragon let out a joyful cry, banked with the turn, and climbed again. High above, the vast snowfield spread out beneath him. In the distance, the mountains rolled on, and the cave belonging to Coldfire was like a dark speck hidden among the mountains. The corners of his mouth lifted unconsciously. So this was what flying was like. This flight lasted for more than an hour. The wind kept whistling in his ears, and his cheeks were frozen stiff. Jon kept fumbling for ways to steer, when to tighten his legs, when to relax his body. Every subtle movement received a varying degree of response from Coldfire. It would take a long time to truly become a dragon rider, but at least he had taken the first step. Jon felt he had done enough for today, so he guided Coldfire to fly toward the open ground near the cave. Upon landing, Coldfire folded her wings and slid a long distance across the snow. Jon finally managed to climb down from the dragon's back, stumbling as he slid down the wing to the ground, nearly face-planting into the snow, and only managed to stand steady by holding onto the dragon's wing. The muscles in his legs and abdomen burned like fire, and every movement pulled painfully. He had just caught his breath when Coldfire suddenly lowered her head and gently nudged his shoulder with her warm snout. The force wasn't heavy, but it nearly knocked him off balance. Those amethyst-like eyes watched him, faintly revealing a touch of smugness. As if she were showing off the flight just now, Jon was taken aback, then couldn't help but laugh out loud. "You nearly threw me to my death." Coldfire let out a low rumble in her throat and slapped her tail against the snow. She looked completely unrepentant. Ouch. He winced in pain, but still slowly trudged over to the campfire. The blast from Coldfire's takeoff had long since blown the campfire into the snow, leaving only a few charred marks exposed on the snow's surface. Jon, Stark, and Thorne only approached after Jon had moved out of Coldfire's safety zone, their faces showing a hint of undisguisable lingering fear. Coldfire didn't seem to care, turning around to gnaw at some loose scales on her wing, her tail casually slapping the snow, kicking up clouds of snow mist. "Next time you take off suddenly like that, remember to warn us in advance," Jon Stark exclaimed. "I thought you just wanted to ride her." "It was Coldfire's idea, not mine." Jon still couldn't help but frown, slowly rubbing his aching thighs. "But I learned a lot. I figured out how to guide her, though I think it will take some time to adapt." Thorne's gaze remained fixed on Coldfire, who was licking her scales in the distance. "The situation just now was too dangerous. You almost fell off." Jon Stark let out a long sigh of relief, his shoulders relaxing as well. Coldfire watched them for a while, seeming to find it amusing, a flash of nearly mischievous light appearing in her amethyst-like eyes. Then she leapt into the air, kicking up a cold whirlwind that showered the three of them with snow particles, the crushed snow sneaking down their collars into their necks. "Where is she going?" Jon Stark asked, patting the snow off his body in a disheveled manner. "She must be hungry," Jon said, still panting as he sat on an exposed rock. "Let's start preparing lunch," Thorne said, turning and walking toward the remains of the campfire beneath the snowdrift. Chapter 14, The Situation of Daenerys. When Daenerys arrived in the dream again, Coldfire was no longer inside the cave but lying quietly outside, letting the moonlight spill over her snow-white scales, appearing exceptionally majestic. The snow was melted into a shallow indentation by her body heat, and the breath she exhaled condensed into wisps of pale mist in the night. Jon was standing in front of her. She lowered her head, nudging that outstretched hand with her snout, her gaze lingering on Daenerys for a moment before she finally settled down completely. Jon turned around and grinned at Daenerys. "You found her," she said softly, her face blooming with a brilliant smile as she ran to him in a few steps. Before he could react, she had jumped up to embrace him, and both of them laughed like children. "Jon, you did it." Coldfire let out a low growl and curled into a ball as if intending to take a nap, the tip of her tail wrapping around her claws to cover her snout. Dany looked at the snow-white form, the smile not yet faded from her face. She's asleep. Jon stepped back slightly, still holding her elbows, his breath still carrying a lingering trace of excitement. I flew with her. How did it feel? It's too cold in the sky. He thought for a moment, then added, but it was worth it. He described the feeling of weightlessness during dives, the moment Coldfire swooped down and suddenly spread her wings, and how he had almost been thrown off, clutching desperately at the spines on her back until his knuckles turned white. At this point he couldn't help but look down at his hands as if the stinging sensation still lingered in his palms. Dany listened intently, occasionally interjecting with gasps of surprise, her laughter constant. She had only seen Snow in dreams and had never ridden a dragon, but listening to him talk, it felt as if she had flown along with him. As he spoke, he stopped, his gaze falling on her face with a hint of inquiry. What about you? Dany pursed her lips, not answering immediately. The night wind blew from some unseen direction, Coldfire yawned and buried her head deeper, the moonlight on her scales shifting along with her. Viserys and I are currently living in Pentos, she finally said. In Magister Illyrio's mansion. He's one of the wealthiest merchants in the city and the estate is magnificent, better than anywhere I've ever lived before. That sounds nice. It sounds that way. She paused, her gaze dropping. Viserys likes it here, but I always feel that he's sheltering us mostly for his own benefit. Jon frowned. How is Viserys doing? She didn't answer immediately. Has he hurt you? No. Dany's gaze drifted elsewhere, her voice lowering. He has changed a lot. I try to remain silent in front of him. It seems I always end up upsetting him. Unless we are talking about his upcoming great conquest of Westeros, that is the only time he is willing to smile. Conquest? With what army? He says there are thousands of loyal supporters in Westeros, and when we return to overthrow the usurper, they will unite to serve House Targaryen once again. Her voice was calm, as if repeating words she had heard too many times already, the fluctuations in her tone completely smoothed out. He also plans to build his own army in Pentos. She looked up at him, a hint of something she couldn't quite define in her eyes. Is what he says true? Will the people there support us? Jon was silent for a moment, appearing to weigh how to answer. I don't know, he admitted. Westeros is very calm right now, but I know that many loyal supporters of House Targaryen have either been exiled or executed. Dany's shoulders slumped slightly, as if weighed down by the truth of those words. Ser Jorah once tried to explain similar things to Viserys, but he just wouldn't listen. Jorah, a knight from Westeros who came to protect us. He is a good man and very patient with Viserys. Jon's brows furrowed deeper, as if searching his mind for some vague impression. That name, I think I've heard Uncle Benjen Stark mention it. It seems he is from House Mormont and was exiled for some reason. Before we meet next, I must ask Lord Mormont. A faint smile touched her lips and she set the name aside for the moment. Are you planning to wake up already? If I had the choice, I would much rather stay here with you, he confessed softly, tentatively raising a hand to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his movements very gentle, as if afraid of disturbing something. Dany felt an imperceptible warmth creep up her cheeks. Since when did you become so smooth with your words? She teased. Jon didn't answer, but a smile touched the corners of his lips. She liked that smile very much, liked it so much she wanted to keep it in her heart and take it back to that magnificent yet cold mansion in Pentos. Coldfire shifted behind him and both of them went quiet. Is it almost time? Dany asked softly, a hint of disappointment in her voice. Sigh. Jon let out a breath. They could only meet like this once every few months, and each meeting was so fleeting, too short to grasp, like snow slipping through fingers. Take care, Will, she replied, and you too. Coldfire also let out a low whine, her tail gently sweeping past their feet. The dream faded, and she still had so much left to say. Dany opened her eyes, the morning light stinging her into a frown. She had to turn over and bury her face in the pillow to escape the glare. She wanted to stay in the dream, even if just for a moment longer, to hear Jon say one more word. The servants at Magister Illyrio's estate would soon arrive to prepare her bath and clothes. She couldn't deny that she enjoyed the feeling of being cared for, the silk bedding, the warm baths, the fresh fruit brought in the morning, and the ever-present, gentle and polite greetings. But deep down there was always a lingering sense of unease, like a tiny thorn hidden beneath the hem of her skirt. It wouldn't prick her on most days, yet it was always there. This kindness was too exquisite. It was as if someone were meticulously setting a stage, with the lights, scenery, and lines already prepared, and she was merely a polished ornament on that stage, waiting to be placed in the right position at the right time for people to admire. She sighed, helplessly accepting the arrival of another day. Perhaps, except for mealtimes, she could try her best to avoid Viserys. The mansion was spacious and magnificent, filled everywhere with colorful silks and carved pillars. The courtyard was planted with exotic flowers and trees whose names she didn't know, and the air was always heavy with sweet incense. Magister Illyrio himself was always smiling and kind in his words. He would ladle an extra spoonful of soup for her at the table and ask her gently if she was doing well when she was silent, as if she were truly just an honored guest being well cared for. But Dany never felt truly at ease here. Whenever Viserys' footsteps echoed from the corridor, she would subconsciously tense her back, a kind of instinctive alertness, because she knew all too well what he was like when he lost control of his emotions. She had seen the way his eyes would suddenly turn cold far too many times. She remembered the light in Jon's eyes when he spoke of flying, and the pure trust when Coldfire lowered her head to nuzzle his palm. In that snow-covered forest, she felt safe, felt loved, even if it was only in a dream, even if that warmth would dissipate completely upon waking. But in Pentos, under the shadow of Viserys who might appear at any moment, and behind Magister Illyrio's seemingly harmless yet calculating smile, Daenerys Targaryen knew clearly that she had never been a true guest at all. Chapter 15, Days at Castle Black. Maester Aemon's voice was low but steady, like a thin stream flowing slowly by the hearth, calm enough to set one at ease. When the Valyrians left the freehold, no one knew the doom would swallow everything. House Targaryen just happened to choose the right time and the right island. Jon sat at the table with a worn parchment book spread out before him. The candlelight made the Valyrian letters on the page look twisted and strange, like symbols from another world. He stared at them for a long time, feeling that even though they were right in front of his eyes, he couldn't grasp their meaning at all. He had been at Castle Black for 3 months. During this time, he had grown accustomed to the biting winds of Castle Black, the footsteps echoing from the tower in the middle of the night, and the way the coal brazier never quite warmed the stone walls. He was also used to the simple meals of the Night's Watch. Few people laughed or spoke loudly here. High Valyrian was harder than he had imagined. I still don't really know how to read it. His fingertip rested on a string of letters tracing slowly along the strokes. When these words are put together, I still can't recognize them all. Aemon sat opposite him, his slightly vacant eyes fixed on some unseen place, a faint smile on his face. You have more patience than many who consider themselves clever. Jon lowered his head and turned a page, his finger pausing on the corner. He didn't think he was particularly clever. He just preferred to connect these dry, difficult letters to something living: Aegon the Conqueror, Visenya, Rhaenys Targaryen, dragons, the throne, bloodlines. Those names were no longer just symbols on a page, they were connected to him. Why did the Targaryens always marry within the family? He couldn't help but ask. This question had been on his mind for many days, and now he finally asked it. Aemon was silent for a moment, as if weighing where to begin. That is a custom left behind by ancient Valyria, the old Maester said slowly. They believed this could preserve their bloodline and the power connected to dragons. The price is also obvious. Inbreeding is not always a good thing, and many families have paid heavy consequences because of it. The price, Jon repeated. The word sounded as if someone had traded the future for something else, yet the Targaryens had walked this path all along. Bloodlines, dragonfire, crowns, the old dreams of Valyria, they were like an invisible chain binding everyone together. Aemon looked up, as if he could see Jon's furrowed brow through his blind eyes. Does this trouble you? Jon was silent for a long time. It wasn't history that troubled him, but the fact that this history was becoming linked to himself. Dragons, the throne, bloodlines, and the name Targaryen, they all made him feel strange and complicated. I don't know, he finally said. You are still young, Aemon said. There is no need to rush to find all the answers. Jon thought for a moment and muttered, I hope so. Aemon smiled. Besides, you don't have a sister to marry. You will likely marry a woman with no blood relation to you. As these light words fell, Jon was inexplicably stunned for a moment. But Dany. Thinking of this, he immediately suppressed the thought, but it was like a spark. Even though it had been pressed into the ashes, it still burned, making his chest tight. He looked down at the book, saying nothing more. One day Dany told him she was getting married. What would he do? There was no answer to this question, but it made his fingertips heat up, and even his breathing became slightly unsteady. This feeling was too foreign, like a small ball of fire suddenly placed into his arms on a snowy night. Even though it was small, it burned restlessly. Continue, Aemon interrupted his wandering thoughts. Aegon the Conqueror and his 2 sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys. Jon steadied himself and began to read again. He knew he had to learn these things. When Aemon was busy with other matters, Jon often went to practice swordsmanship with Alliser. The training ground at Castle Black was not large, the ground covered year-round with frozen mud and a thin layer of frost. Every morning the recruits were scolded by the instructor until they couldn't lift their heads. This knight had a terrible temper and a loud voice. Whoever moved slowly, whoever had messy footwork, or whoever held their sword incorrectly, he would scold them mercilessly. When they actually sparred, he held nothing back, but when it was Jon's turn, Alliser would always pull his strike at the very last second before the blade touched him. Go easy on me. After being tapped on the shoulder by the sword tip again, Jon frowned and spoke. Thorne raised an eyebrow. I didn't, you barely touched me. You're just a child, Thorne replied coldly. I'm afraid of hurting you. If someone really came to kill me, they wouldn't hold back. Besides, we're using wooden swords. Jon gripped the hilt tightly, looking at him seriously. If you don't let me take a real hit, I will never learn. Thorne stared at him for a long while, the knuckles gripping the hilt tightening slightly, a faint, complex emotion flashing in its eyes. Fine, Thorne finally said. Once the real sparring began, Alliser's sword immediately became sharper. He crushed Jon with his strength. Every strike was as heavy as falling ice, pressing straight down. Jon retreated repeatedly as soon as he engaged, relying entirely on his agility to dodge and weave, never meeting force with force and only striking when he found a gap in the opponent's form. Every time Thorn's sword descended, it felt as if it wanted to pin Jon to the ground. But strangely, sometimes before the sword had actually swung, Jon's body would instinctively dodge. His intuition was astonishing, always a step ahead of the blade. At the beginning his wrists and shoulders ached with pain, but fortunately he persevered. Now he could steady his footing when Thorn pressed in, and even find space for a counterattack the moment the opponent's center of gravity shifted slightly. One day, Jon finally forced Sir Alizer back half a step. The knight paused, eyebrows raised slightly, then laughed softly. "You have improved a lot." "It's because you taught me well," Jon said, panting. "Then keep practicing." Jon gripped the hilt firmly again. The days at Castle Black passed one by one, and the nights were always long. After training ended that day, Jon hurried back to the cave at the Frostfangs in the twilight. In a few days the weather would get colder, and he would need to stay at Castle Black permanently, unable to visit Coldfire often. The white dragon was curled up by the campfire near the cave, eyes half closed, her tail occasionally sweeping the ground, kicking up a layer of fine snow powder. Moonlight fell on her scales like a thin layer of frost. She looked very quiet. Jon stood not far away and whistled softly. Coldfire opened one eye and looked toward him. Jon reached out and pointed at the fire, whispering the word he had just learned. Dragonfire. In High Valyrian, this was the word for dragonfire. He thought to himself quietly that the next time he saw Dany in his dreams, he would teach her this word. Coldfire tilted her head, as if trying to distinguish what he was doing. She exhaled a puff of white mist from her nostrils, stared at the dancing flames, and after a moment suddenly raised her head. The next instant a pure white flame shot violently into the night sky. A wave of heat rushed toward his face, and Jon almost instinctively raised his hand to cover it. "Seven hell," someone nearby cursed in a low voice. The flames gradually died down. Coldfire tucked her chin and looked at Jon, emitting a low purr from her throat, as if waiting for his next intention. Jon couldn't help but laugh. "Good girl." Coldfire lowered her head slightly and leaned in, waiting for him to place his hand on her. Jon touched her scales, which were both cold and warm. Jon leaned against Coldfire's warm scales, looking up at the silent towers in the distance and the black night further away. A vague but firm thought suddenly arose in his heart. He was no longer just a bastard hiding in a corner of Winterfell. He had a sword to practice and someone far across the narrow sea waiting for him. Chapter 16. Family. His horse's hooves struck the cobblestones of Winterfell. Jon spotted a small, black-clad figure sprinting from the gate from afar. Jon, Arya practically collided into his arms. He laughed and lifted her up, spinning her around, which made her giggle, her hands patting his shoulders hard as if afraid he might drop her. "Arya, were you gone for so long this time?" she said, hugging him tightly, her eyes as bright as the sharpest glint of snow on a winter branch. Father had once said she looked like Lyanna, and her restless nature was exactly the same. Robb followed behind, chuckling involuntarily before immediately putting on a facade of feigned solemnity. "Have you fought any wildlings?" "No." "Then have you seen any White Walkers?" "None either." Robb immediately looked disappointed. Jon answered expressionlessly, "I have ridden a dragon." "You might as well just say you've sat on the Iron Throne." Robb rolled his eyes and snorted, clearly disbelieving. Arya and Bran laughed until they were bent double. Sansa stood a little further away, not approaching, only offering him a polite smile. She was much quieter than in his memories, her demeanor so dignified she hardly seemed like a girl from the north. Catelyn and Lord Eddard stood on the steps, smiling and nodding at him. "Let's go inside first. Jon needs to eat something." Great Hall of Winterfell remained warm, the fire in the hearth burning brightly, casting long shadows on the walls that swayed gently with the crackling of the coals. The air was filled with the scent of stew, bread, ale, and firewood. As Jon sat in his familiar spot, he suddenly felt as if he were living in another lifetime. Having stayed at Castle Black for so long, he found himself momentarily unaccustomed to the heat here. Robb sat beside him, scanning his shoulders, and suddenly asked, "Did you grow taller again?" "I haven't measured," Jon shrugged. "Just height." Robb reached out and patted his shoulder, looking surprised. "When did your shoulders get so sturdy?" Jon shrugged without speaking. The winds and snows of Castle Black, the daily training, and the trekking north of the wall seemed to have a power that was gradually changing his body, something even he hadn't noticed. It wasn't until he returned to Winterfell and Robb touched him like that he realized his shoulders were indeed a bit broader. Early the next morning, Jon went to the Lord's study. It was much warmer than outside, and the light falling through the stained glass windows spread out in colorful fragments on the floor. The leaves of the cold-hardy plants by the wall still clung with morning dew. Ned stood by the window with his hands behind his back, turning around upon hearing footsteps. He looked at Jon, his tone still calm. "How have you been these past few months?" Jon spoke almost immediately. "I have started practicing flying." He poured out everything he had learned, including High Valyrian, Maester Aemon's teachings, and Coldfire's temperament and the feeling of flight. These were the things he had most wanted to share during these days. Ned listened quietly, his expression only slowly darkening when he mentioned deaneries and visories. "It seems the news from King's Landing is true," Ned said. "You mean visories?" Jon frowned. "He's becoming more and more like a madman." Catelyn stood to the side, her tone filled with unease. Jon's expression was serious. They sold Queen Rhaella's crown for food. Since then he has become increasingly irritable and Dany is very afraid of him now. Expression on Ned's face became very heavy. Jon looked up at him somewhat urgently. Can I not help her? I don't want Viserys to hurt her. Ned looked at him and only after a while did he speak. If we bring her back to Westeros, Robert will kill her. His voice was heavy. Not just her, our entire family could be implicated. You can barely hide your identity here, but her Valyrian lineage is too obvious. It cannot be hidden. Jon's hands slowly clenched. So we can only wait. For now, yes, Ned said it very directly. And the last thing you should do right now is risk your life to save her. You have just found your dragon and there is still too much to learn. Catelyn walked over to him and gently pressed on his shoulder. You need more time to grow. Jon was silent for a long time. He knew Ned was right. Several days later he set off for the wall with Benjen, Stark and Thorne. The wind was strong that day and snow swept down from the horizon in layers as if the entire world were covered by a grayish-white curtain. When they were still 2 days away from the wall, a shout from Sir Alizer suddenly came from behind. Enemy attack! Jon turned his horse around. He saw 3 wildlings in close pursuit behind and several others encircling them from the front. The men wore heavy animal skins, their faces covered in frostbite and scratches, and their weapons were in poor condition. Some held axes, some rusted knives, and others gripped short spears, approaching while shouting. An arrow grazed Benjen Stark's shoulder and flew past, embedding itself in the snow behind him. Damn it, why would wildlings appear here? Benjen Stark cursed under his breath, pulling the reins sharply to avoid them. A wildling charged from the side. Swinging an axe at Jon's head, Jon instinctively raised his sword to parry. The iron clashed, vibrating through his wrist. Using the momentum of his horse, he dodged to the side and the tip of his sword swept across the opponent's waist. The wildling cried out in pain and tilted off the horse. Another wildling seized the opportunity to lunge, the blade sliding almost against Jon's arm, slicing through his clothes. He gritted his teeth, struck back, forced the opponent to retreat, and then took the chance to put some distance between them. On the other side, Benjen Stark had already cut down one man, and Alizer's greatsword had knocked the weapon from another wildling who tumbled off his horse, nearly being trampled by his companion. The remaining wildlings, seeing the situation turning against them, began to scatter and flee. Don't let them get away, Benjen Stark shouted. The 3 immediately spurred their horses in pursuit. The snow was rugged and difficult to traverse, and both sides charged through woods and hills one after the other, but the distance never fully closed. Just then a higher, sharper roar rang out. Coldfire swooped down from the snow curtain, her massive body crashing into the battlefield like a white meteor. Her sharp claws swept across the ground, directly severing several low, withered trees ahead, her amethyst-like eyes burning with rage. The horses let out terrified neighs, freezing in place and shivering. Coldfire lunged forward, biting down on a wildling and his mount, then whipped her head around violently, flinging both man and horse away. When they hit the snow, there was a dull, crunching sound. The remaining few wildlings saw this, their faces turning deathly pale, and they screamed in terror. Dragonfire! Jon shouted loudly. A hissing low rumble came from Coldfire's throat, and the next moment a stream of white, nearly blinding fire erupted, instantly sweeping across the snow ahead. The snow melted, vaporized, and churned in the fire. The wildlings and horses were engulfed by the flames, their screams cut short by the heatwave. The frozen earth was scorched black and the air was filled with a pungent, burning smell. The surroundings suddenly fell silent. Only the sound of the wind remained, along with the faint snapping of broken branches and the crackling of dying embers in the snow in the distance. Benjen Stark dismounted and walked quickly to Jon's side, first glancing at the cut on his arm, then at the corpse lying in the snow. He said nothing, just patted his shoulder heavily. You are hurt? Benjen Stark asked anxiously. It's just a scratch. Jon looked down at the line of blood, his fingers trembling slightly. This was the first time he had killed someone, and the feeling was terrible. Thorne also walked over, first scanning him, then looking up at Coldfire's massive white form, remaining silent for a long time. For your first battle you performed better than most, he praised. Chapter 17. Insomnia. At night Jon suffered from insomnia. Snow, corpses, the twisted necks of fallen horses, and the wide-open eyes of wildlings before they died flashed before his eyes again and again. The feeling of killing a person with his own hands was completely different from what he had imagined. The wind outside the camp was loud, and the trees rustled as if something living was tossing and turning in the darkness. Jon tossed and turned, unable to close his eyes, and finally he simply threw on his cloak, got up, lifted the tent flap and walked out. The cold wind grazed his cheeks like a knife. The moonlight illuminated the snow, making it look blue, and every step he took made a faint crunching sound that echoed clearly in the empty camp. Without thinking too much, he walked in the direction where Coldfire was resting. Inside the tent behind him there was the sound of someone getting up. Someone was watching him. Coldfire was lying on the ground with her eyes closed, her tail curled at her side. The white mist exhaled from her nostrils flickered in the night like some kind of slow and restless breathing. Hearing footsteps, she opened her eyes. Jon stood before her, not immediately reaching out. "Why did you come here today?" he asked in a low voice. Coldfire tilted her head, making a low sound in her throat as if trying to discern the meaning of the words. "Did you follow me, or did you sense that I would be in danger?" Jon sighed softly. "I always feel like you understand things that even I don't understand." Coldfire looked at him, her amethyst-like eyes exceptionally clear in the night, with a flicker of starlight reflected deep within her pupils. Jon reached out and touched the scales on her lower jaw. They were cold and hard, yet the subtle rise and fall beneath his palm was clearly alive, steady enough to be reassuring. "I killed someone today," he said softly, as if finally digging these words out from his throat. Coldfire did not respond, only lowered her head a little more, almost touching his shoulder. "I wasn't afraid. I didn't feel bad either. Now there is only peace." "Do you know what that means?" he asked her. There was one more thing he didn't say. He felt that he was cold-blooded by nature and was afraid of becoming someone like the Mad King. Coldfire naturally wouldn't answer, but she made a low sound, moved closer to his shoulder and gently touched his sleeve with her nose, the movement carrying a hint of comfort. The tightness in Jon's chest suddenly loosened a little. "It's good to have you." After saying that, he lay down on Coldfire's body. The next morning, Benjen Stark found him. Obviously, it was he who had been watching him last night, just standing there and looking at him for a while. "How did you sleep last night?" "Not very well." Benjen Stark nodded. "It's like that the first time." Jon was silent. "Fact that you weren't afraid doesn't mean you're cold-blooded." Benjen Stark looked at him, his tone steady. "You killed an enemy. If we don't kill them, others will get hurt. Wildlings often raid, and you did what you had to do." Jon nodded without immediately replying. Benjen Stark glanced at him again and suddenly smiled. "When you struck in the snow, you were as calm as a wolf, precise and deadly." Jon was taken aback. "You were like a wolf that has locked onto its prey and knows when to strike. You are truly a Stark, kid." Jon stood there, stunned, and didn't speak for a long time. The style of the Stark family. When these words fell into his ears, his chest suddenly trembled slightly, as if someone had knocked on the ice with their knuckles in the dark. The feeling was different from the emptiness he felt when facing the corpses last night. It was heavier and deeper, as if something that had been sleeping in his blood for a long time had been quietly touched. He couldn't help but think of the giant heart tree in the godswood of Winterfell, the wind and snow of the north, and the white wolf that appeared first in winter. "You don't like this description?" Benjen Stark asked. Jon shook his head. "I like your description." He just suddenly realized that there were some things about him that perhaps were no longer what he thought they were. Alizer was also watching him from the side. The knight did not speak, his gaze heavier than usual. After a while, he walked over. "Let me check your wound again." A few days later, Castle Black, in the empty training ground, instructor Alizer held two training swords and handed one to Jon. "You have already killed a man. Let me see your current level. Attack me with all your might." Jon gripped the hilt again and stood firm. The snow under his feet crunched softly. Alizer did not hold back, his moves faster and more direct than before. Facing such a violent attack, he was a bit overwhelmed at first, relying on his sense of crisis, his body instinctively reacting. Once he adapted to the rhythm, Jon remembered Benjen Stark's description. Calm, precise, finding the right moment to strike in the chaos. Not every move needed to be blocked, and not every attack was worth meeting head-on. What he really needed to do was avoid the most dangerous blow, and then when the opponent left an opening, deliver a fatal strike. He began to understand how to hide his figure in the wind, how to make his footsteps lighter, and how to use shorter movements for faster reactions. After a few rounds, Jon's sword stopped in front of Thorne's neck. "You lost." Jon was panting slightly, sweat already seeping from his forehead, but his eyes were incredibly bright. Thorne glanced at him and said indifferently, "Don't be too proud, you only won once." But his tone had a bit more pride than before. A few days later, Jon went to see Coldfire again. Her dwelling had been changed to another place closer to Castle Black. She was poking at a frozen animal bone with her front claws in the snow, which sounded like some kind of boring pastime. Seeing him arrive, she immediately raised her head, a short, low hum emitting from her throat, and then she moved her body to the side to make room for him to get close. Jon squatted down beside her and reached out to touch the familiar scales. The touch was cold, but it carried an indescribable sense of stability. "Uncle Benjen Stark said I am a true Stark," he said softly. Coldfire blinked and suddenly lowered her head, gently rubbing against his forehead. The movement was very light, but it made Jon quiet down all at once. Whether it was a wolf, a dragon, a snowy night, or blood, everything seemed to be converging in the same direction. When night fell again in the camp, Benjen Stark and Jon sat together eating. "Ned knows you were injured and asked how your recovery is going and whether you need to return to Winterfell," Benjen Stark said. "Everyone at home is very worried about you." Jon nodded. "I have recovered. There is only a shallow scar and I don't want to go back yet." Benjen Stark looked at him for a while as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he only patted his shoulder. The wind was still blowing and the snow drifted in from afar like the ashes of the past. Chapter 18. The Night's Watch. 4 years passed in the blink of an eye. Castle Black remained an old fortress repeatedly eroded by wind, snow, and time. Outside it was as cold and hard as iron, Yet inside lived many strange men persevering in their own ways. Maester Eamon's obscure lessons, Alliser Thorne's merciless, brutal training, and secret solitude beyond the wall filled nearly every day of Jon Stark's life. He had grown from that 12-year-old northern boy into a 16-year-old youth with a nimble physique and a steady gaze. The blacksmith shop at Castle Black was filled year-round with the pungent smell of charcoal fires, iron filings, and scorched leather. When Jon pushed open the heavy wooden door, the one-armed giant Donalnoy was bare-chested, wielding a hammer with his only remaining right hand. Clang, clang, the heavy hammer struck the red-hot sword billet, sending sparks flying. Suddenly a crisp and harsh crack tore through the rhythmic striking. The nearly formed longsword in the moment of quenching split open with a damaging fissure along the spine. "Damn boy," Noy spat and casually tossed the ruined sword into a pile of scrap metal nearby. He turned his head, staring coldly at Jon with his single eye. "You're here again, Stark's bastard. You can watch, but don't block my light." Jon did not speak immediately. He simply walked over silently, reached out to grip the wooden handle, and began to pull the bellows in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Hiss hiss, the rhythm of the bellows slowed by 3 beats, and the originally violently leaping dark red furnace fire under the youth's steady pulling gradually became gentle and pure. Donalnoy shot him a sidelong glance but said nothing. He silently inserted a new piece of iron, pulled it out after it was thoroughly heated, and raised the heavy hammer again. 1 hammer strike, 2 strikes. Half an hour later, when the new sword was plunged into the quenching bucket again, there was a hiss, and white smoke billowed. The blade was intact, with no further cracks. The one-armed blacksmith stared at the sword billet, which was emitting a cold light, and remained silent for a long time. "Heat was decent today," Noy said gruffly. Jon released the bellows, dusted the charcoal ash off his hands, and smiled. "If the fire is too fierce, the iron becomes brittle." Noy wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking at the 16-year-old youth directly for the first time. The muscles on his weather-beaten face twitched slightly. "Come by in the afternoon from now on," Noy said, placing the hammer on the anvil. "Help me with the bellows." After leaving the blacksmith shop, Jon was brought into the Lord Commander's tower. The room was much warmer than outside, and the table was piled high with documents from various places. Old Bear Jeor Mormont sat behind the desk, his sharp eyes like charcoal in a fire, staring fixedly at Jon as he entered. The old bear wasted no words, suddenly flicking his hand and slamming a rough map of the lands beyond the wall onto the desk. "Assume you are a ranger captain now." Mormont's thick, short finger jabbed fiercely into the depths of the haunted forest on the map. "You are patrolling with 10 brothers and run into 50 wildling raiders in the wind and snow. Behind you is a cliff, in front is frozen ground. What do you do?" This was an exam without warning. Jon pressed his hand against the longsword at his waist, walked to the desk, and swept his gaze over the map. "I wouldn't fight, my lord," Jon answered decisively. 50 wildlings would tear you apart like wolves," Mormont shouted in a deep voice. "Are you going to be a deserter? This is not fleeing, it is the duty of the Night's Watch." Jon extended 2 fingers, tracing a narrow line along the edge of the cliff. "For 10 rangers to assault 50 wildlings is foolish. I would leave 2 men behind to use heavy crossbows to kite them at the only narrow path on the cliff, buying time, while the rest withdraw at full speed to Castle Black to bring you the news of the wildlings moving south. The duty of the Night's Watch is to ensure the message gets back." Room fell silent. Mormont stared intently at Jon, and the stern lines on his bearded old face finally softened a little. "Alliser says you are an arrogant wolf pup." The old bear moved his finger away and said indifferently, "It seems Eamon has taught you something truly useful. Go on. Bowen Marsh and Yoren are waiting for you in the supply depot." In the supply depot, Lord Steward Bowen Marsh was fiddling with an abacus, his brows furrowed so tightly they were nearly twisted into a knot. "Weather is getting colder, and this year's charcoal quota will have to be reduced again," Marsh complained to Jon as he approached. "If you keep coming to collect it every day like this, Castle Black will run out of coal sooner or later. You are a Stark, you don't need to worry about food and clothing, but most people in this castle can't even guarantee a bowl of hot soup. If you really stay here in the future, remember this." Jon took the charcoal bag, stood where he was, and nodded. "I understand, Lord Marsh." Later he slowly came to understand that although Marsh always seemed to be haggling over every penny, if there weren't such people carefully counting every grain of food, the lives of the Night's Watch would only be even harder. Nearby, the recruiter Yoren, who had just returned from the south and was covered in mud, was squatting on the ground, chewing on hard bread while digging mud out of a horseshoe with a dirty dagger. "Forget it, Bowen, counting on the south?" Yoren spat out breadcrumbs, shot a sidelong glance at Jon. "The king, he's probably forgotten there's a wall in the north. Taxes in King's Landing have gone up again. The Westerlands had a good harvest this year, but they won't give a single grain of rice to the crows." Jon squatted down and handed Yoren a horse brush. "What about the north?" "Winterfell is all right. Lord Stark is still holding on, but Bear Island has been harassed by Ironborn again. But the strangest thing isn't the Ironborn." Yoren took the brush and lowered his voice. "I heard when I came back this time that 2 villages north of the Gift are empty. The people are gone, but the food and livestock are still there. Some people say footprints that shouldn't belong to humans have appeared in the forest, and wildlings are fleeing south more frequently than in previous years." He paused and looked toward the darkness beyond the wall. This wind, it's not right. Jon did not speak, his palm unconsciously clenching tight. After ending the day's training, Jon put on his black cloak, walked alone through the ice gate at the base of the wall and stepped into the wind and snow beyond the wall. He did not stop at the foot of the wall, but followed the ice field all the way north until the firelight of Castle Black completely disappeared, only then walking into a secret canyon surrounded by jagged rocks and pine forests. This place not only avoided the sight of the wall's sentries but was also the place where he and Coldfire had agreed to meet. Jon slowly closed his eyes. An invisible mental connection crossed the long snowfields, extending toward the north. He did not make a sound, only calling out softly in his heart. A moment later, Jon slowly opened his eyes. He knew Coldfire had heard him, so he stood where he was, waiting quietly. About an hour later, at the end of the wind and snow, a massive white figure appeared quietly. It made no sound, just skimming across the sky under the cover of night like a silent shadow. Boom! Coldfire landed between the canyon, snow churning, the earth trembling slightly. The deep blue dragon eyes slowly lit up. 16 years of growth had long since made her a true dragon. Dragon scales as white as frost covered her entire body. The long and muscular dragon body stood quietly in the wind and snow, and when her wings were folded, they still covered a large patch of snow. Jon walked up and gently patted Coldfire's cold dragon snout. Coldfire lowered her head and rubbed gently against his palm. The next moment, she slowly spread her wings. A fierce wind whipped up the sky full of snow, and the massive dragon body soared into the sky. Her huge wings swept across the night sky, disappearing into the depths of the boundless wind and snow in an instant. Jon stood quietly in the wind and snow, watching that white figure vanish into the night sky. 16 years had passed. That dragon, which could only hide in a cave back then, was now truly soaring through the sky. The wind and snow continued to howl, and the snowfields beyond the wall, which had been silent for thousands of years, finally saw the shadow of a dragon once again. Chapter 19, Daenerys's Crisis. A few days later, Jon temporarily left Castle Black and returned to Winterfell, arriving just in time for his 16th birthday. By evening, the entire Great Hall was ablaze with light. A roaring fire burned in the hearth, its heat dispelling the chill of a winter night in the north. The long tables were laden with freshly baked rye bread, roasted deer legs sizzling with grease, fragrant honey-roasted duck, and steaming beef stew, while servants moved back and forth, constantly replenishing the food and drink. Winterfell did not have the luxurious and indulgent traditions of King's Landing, but it possessed a warmth that belonged uniquely to House Stark. Eddard Stark sat at the head of the table, a rare, relaxed smile on his face, while Catelyn sat beside him, watching the children with gentle eyes. Robb had already downed 2 mugs of ale and was loudly recounting some unfunny military camp joke, making Bran and Arya roar with laughter. "By the old gods, Robb, your joke isn't even funny," Sansa sighed helplessly. "I'm not a bard." Robb raised his eyebrows defiantly, and a wave of good-natured laughter erupted in the hall. Even Hodor, passing by with a large platter of roasted meat, grinned and shouted happily, "Hodor. Hodor!" Jon looked at his younger siblings gathered around him and couldn't help but smile. Little Rickon clung to his leg and refused to let go. Bran gave him a crude wooden dagger he had whittled himself. Arya rushed to push a crookedly carved wooden wolf into his hand, chin held high with pride. Sansa gave him a gray wool scarf she had knitted herself, the stitches fine and warm. Finally, Robb stood up and handed him a quality steel sword, patting his shoulder with a smile. "Take it. Next time you come back from the wall, we'll have a proper spar." Camaraderie flowed beneath the firelight, and the great hall was filled with laughter and joy. Theon Greyjoy sat on the other side of the long table, holding a mug of ale, his face still wearing that familiar, cynical, arrogant smile. Yet his gaze would drift almost unconsciously to Jon, who was surrounded by the others. He watched as Arya rushed over to hug Jon, and saw the gentleness in Eddard's eyes when he looked at his bastard son. No one on Pike would prepare a feast for him, and Lord Balon never remembered his birthday. This warmth that belonged to the Starks, he was, after all, an outsider. Theon lowered his head and took a large, bitter gulp of ale, suppressing the heartache, and muttered to himself with self-deprecation, "Damn it, it's fucking enviable." Just then, the steward Poole walked into the hall with a hurried expression, whispered a few words into Lord Stark's ear, and presented a secret letter sealed with the King's Landing wax. After the banquet ended, candles flickered in the Lord's study. "King is coming to Winterfell." Robb looked at the secret letter on the table, his face full of surprise. "Yes," Eddard frowned, his eyes filled with hidden worry. "Robert didn't give a specific reason, only that it's an emergency. He, Queen Cersei, and the 3 children are leading a large entourage toward the north. They are already on the road." Jon stood in the corner of the study and spoke up. "I should return to Castle Black before the royal procession arrives, right?" "Why?" Bran blinked innocently. "Because he is a bastard, Bran. It would be impolite for the royal family from the south to see him." Sansa stated the noble etiquette she had learned calmly. "Sansa," Eddard warned in a deep voice. "It's just the truth," Sansa muttered, lowering her head. Jon didn't mind. Instead, he playfully ruffled Bran's hair to break the tension, smiling. "I just want to explore beyond the wall. I'm not interested in the petty squabbles of these southern nobles." giggled, and the tense atmosphere in the study eased slightly. But Jon's hand, hidden beneath his cloak, clenched tightly. He knew very well that King Robert's arrival meant that a true, bloody storm was about to begin in Westeros. The night deepened, the banquet dispersed completely, and all of Winterfell fell into a deathly silence. Jon returned to his room. Perhaps because of the news he heard during the day, he didn't sleep well that night. Caught between wakefulness and sleep, his consciousness sank once more into that void of white mist. Everything around him coalesced again. Yet this time the silver-haired girl who always smiled at him in his dreams was curled up in the corner of cold stone walls. Months had passed, and she had grown a little taller, but she looked thinner. Her face was deathly pale and her body trembled slightly in her sleep. When she opened her eyes and saw Jon, those violet eyes were filled with helplessness and desperate terror. "Dany, what happened?" Jon's heart tightened as he hurried over. Daenerys looked up, tears instantly welling up, her voice trembling violently. "Brother, my brother is going to sell me to a Dothraki Khal to be his bride." Jon looked at her in disbelief. "I saw that Khal Drogo today." Dany hugged her slender, fragile body tightly as if trying to hide herself. "He is a savage. The way he looked at me. It was like looking at a piece of meat waiting to be slaughtered." Jon pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, letting the girl sob desperately on his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, suppressing his anger, and asked, "Is Viserys insane? What on earth does he want to do?" "He thinks that by selling me to the Khal, he can convince the Dothraki to send troops to help him cross the narrow sea and take back the Iron Throne." Daenerys sobbed. "I tried to refuse him, told him I didn't want to marry." At this point her body suddenly stiffened, and her voice stopped abruptly. "What did he do?" Jon's voice was as cold as an ice cellar beyond the wall. Daenerys only cried and said nothing, but the terror in her eyes said it all. "He pulled my hair and pushed me to the ground." She cried and clutched Jon's clothes tightly. "He said I had no right to argue. He said if I dared to disobey him again, he would awaken the dragon's wrath." For the first time in his life, Jon felt such a strong urge to kill. He kissed Dany's forehead tenderly, forcing himself to calm down. "When is the wedding?" "Where?" "In a month in Pentos," Daenerys replied weakly. "Khal Drogo is gathering his colossal." A month Pentos across the vast narrow sea. Jon's brain raced. If he took the normal route, there was no way he could reach the continent of Essos within a month. Only by riding Coldfire, crossing the narrow sea from the sky, could he make it. "I will come for you." Jon cupped her face, his gaze as hard as iron. "I will fly over on a dragon. Whatever Viserys wants to do, I will stop him." "No, Jon, they will kill you." Dany was terrified, turning to hold him tightly. "The Dothraki are too dangerous. That is their territory. Khal Drogo has the largest colossal on the entire plains. He has 40,000 riders. Even if I have to go to war with 40,000 Dothraki riders, I will definitely come to save you." Jon's gaze was burning and resolute. He branded the girl deep into his sight. Even if it meant exposing the secret of Coldfire, even if it meant completely overturning the future of this world, he would never turn back. He kissed her silver hair, and in the split second before the dream shattered, he left his final vow: "Wait for me, Dany." Meanwhile, beyond the wall on the snowy plains, Coldfire, who had been sleeping, slowly opened her deep blue dragon eyes. She felt the rage at the other end of the bond, a rage that burned almost everything. That emotion was as intense as a blazing flame. The next moment, the white dragon spread her wings and soared into the night sky. Chapter 20. Leaving Winterfell, the night was deep. The walls of Winterfell stood in the wind and snow, blocking most of the storm. Torches flickered on the ramparts, casting dim, yellow light onto the accumulated snow. The entire castle had fallen silent. Only the wind passed through the towers, courtyards, and corridors, emitting a low, whistling sound. Jon stood by the door, clutching two letters in his hand. One was for Eddard and Catelyn. It did not contain much, only briefly explaining that he was going to Pentos and outlining his intentions. The other was left for Uncle Benjen Stark, telling him that Coldfire would be leaving the north with him, which served as an explanation for those at Castle Black. He did not intend to say this in person. His father would not agree, nor would Catelyn. If his family knew in advance Robb, Sansa, Arya, everyone would try to persuade him to stay. Daenerys was being pushed into a marriage he would never accept. Time was tight, and he had to leave immediately. Jon placed the letters in the most conspicuous spot, turned around, and began to pack the things he needed. Dry rations, a waterskin, a map of the north, a small pouch of gold dragons and silver stags, and that worn-out ancient book were all essentials he had to take. Finally, he slid the Valyrian steel sword Longclaw into its scabbard and fastened it to the most accessible position at his waist. This sword was the ancestral blade of House Mormont. Last year Jeor Mormont had personally handed it to him. The old bear was very old now, and one could clearly see he struggled when swinging a sword, but when he handed the blade to Jon, his hand was steady. "I'm old now and have no use for it. You will need it more," Mormont had said. "You are always running beyond the wall. A reliable sword is more important than anything. When you no longer need it, you can return it to House Mormont." Jon had always remembered those words. He tightened his backpack, checked the straps one last time, and took a final look at the room. A narrow bed, an old table, a wooden chest in the corner, and the oil lamp by the window that was about to go out. He had lived here for over a decade. After leaving tonight, he did not know when he would be able to return, or perhaps he never would. Jon did not linger any longer. he reached out to snuff the lamp and pushed the door open to step into the night. He walked along the corridor, his footsteps steady, making almost no sound on the stone floor. When he passed the godswood, he paused for a moment. It was very quiet under the heart tree. The red leaves swayed gently in the wind like a cluster of low-burning fire. When Jon looked up, he happened to see a raven perched on a branch. With feathers so black they were almost devoid of any other color, it neither called out nor moved. It simply stood there, facing directly toward him. Jon stopped and glanced at it. The raven was also looking at him. Jon ignored it, stood for a moment, then turned and continued walking. He did not think much of it, but the gaze of that raven remained in his mind. After leaving the godswood, the night watch of Winterfell remained strict, but when the guards saw him, they stood up straight after just one glance. Jon, he was a son of House Stark, frequently traveling between the wall and Winterfell. With such status, the gate guards would not bother questioning him, let alone stop him at this hour. Jon simply nodded, and the guards immediately stepped aside. He led his horse out of the gate, his pace steady without hesitation. Only when he was far enough from the walls did he mount the horse and ride toward the depths of the northern wilderness. There was snow everywhere on the ground, and the wind was biting cold. The horse's hooves crunched on the thin snow with dull thuds. The lights of Winterfell shrank behind him, turning from a warm glow into a blurred speck of light, until finally even that speck was no longer visible. As he neared the meeting point with Coldfire, the wind suddenly stopped for an instant. The snowflakes in the air seemed to be held up by something, then suddenly scattered to both sides. His mount immediately became restless, pawing the frozen earth with its front hooves and snorting continuously. Jon pulled hard on the reins and looked up at the sky. The next moment, a massive white shadow dove down fiercely from the gray clouds. Coldfire had arrived, diving straight down from high above. The air pressure swept to the ground first, kicking up a sheet of snow like a white wave. When the dragon landed, the ice beneath her feet emitted a series of crisp cracking sounds, and the ground shook. The horse, startled, backed away a few steps. Jon steadied the horse's neck, dismounted, and walked quickly toward Coldfire. She lowered her head, her purple vertical pupils fixed firmly on him. Jon raised his hand and stroked her bridge of the nose. He did not waste any more time. He stepped onto the dragon's spine, swung himself up, and secured Longclaw in his backpack. Fly. Coldfire let out a low hiss from her throat as a response. The next moment she spread her wings wide. The moment she took off, the ground seemed to suddenly sink away. A gale swirled in from all sides. Jon crouched low, gripping the spikes on the dragon's spine tightly. Coldfire beat her wings, her massive body soaring into the air while snow, dust, and crushed ice were swept into the sky. Valleys, forests, cliffs, and snowfields all receded rapidly. Winterfell was also receding. Jon looked down. The ancient castle had become a black outline, growing smaller and farther away. Coldfire continued to climb, the wind and snow stretching his vision further, leaving the castle completely behind. Jon withdrew his gaze and tightened his grip on the dragon's spine. He had left Winterfell. From this moment on, he was no longer just Jon Snow of the North. He was going south to find Daenerys, to rescue her from that marriage that should never have been hers, and to complete the things that needed to be done one by one. Coldfire carried him into the night sky, flying south. The night wind hit his face. It was very cold, biting at his skin. The next day, when a servant went to Jon's bedroom with washing supplies, they knocked for a long time without receiving a response. When Eddard pushed the door open and entered the room, he realized something was wrong. The quilt was folded neatly, and there were 2 letters on the table. When the Duke sat on the edge of the bed and finished reading the letter, he felt a chill crawl from his spine to the back of his neck, and even his fingertips grew cold. Catelyn took the paper, scanned it once, and her breath hitched. "He's gone?" she asked softly. Eddard did not answer immediately. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to read the words on the letter again. "He has gone to find Daenerys," Eddard finally said, his voice low. Catelyn froze for a moment, then looked up at him. "Just based on a message from a dream. He has told me many things about dragon dreams over the past few years, and he firmly believes they are all true." After saying this, Eddard slowly folded the letter. Catelyn pressed her hand to her forehead and slowly sat on a nearby stool. "He is still a child. Has grown up," Eddard said in a low voice. "He is no longer the child who only knows how to hide in the shadows, waiting for others to make decisions for him." When he said this, there was an indescribable complexity in his voice, like a father realizing that the child he had raised with his own hands had begun to make choices that even he could not predict. After rising and leaving Jon's room, he ordered men to search for traces of Jon along the way. He knew it was impossible to find him, but he still had to send men out. In case the child had not yet left the north, he had to try.